Mike from Washington, who I think is a theist. And Mike, are you saying that the emergence of information had to come from somewhere? Is that your argument?
Yes.
Okay, would you like to elaborate?
Well, you guys have a gap, the naturalist atheists, you guys have a gap from chemicals to a living cell, a self-sustaining, self-replicating cell. So anyway, there's a certain amount of DNA
hang on a second.
required.
Mike, sorry, what do you is this what you're going to be discussing? The kind of the creation of
abiogenesis?
Or was that just a general comment? I want to know how that ties into your information has to come from somewhere.
The information, to keep it simple, like one strand of DNA in a woman's fertilized egg, there's enough information there to construct in order and sequence 200 different types of cells into 37 trillion cells of an adult. And
can you define information, Mike? Can you define information, Mike?
Well, instructions.
No, information. You said information has to come from somewhere, and I just want to know what your definition of information is.
Well, how about this? What is it about DNA that what causes a fertilized egg becomes a human being if it isn't aborted or naturally or deliberately? What is it about that DNA what construct a 37 trillion cell adult? If that's not information.
Well, it's just chemical reaction.
That's not a definition of information, though, is it? Yeah, so that is a kind of a deflection from the question here. I mean, in order, we could say, well, that is information. You're just pointing at an example of something you're calling information. In that case, it's like circular, because you're saying, well, this is information. No, so what is information?
Well, what is it? What is it about DNA? Is DNA required to assemble for a human being to become an adult?
Yes.
So I think the reason why the reason why we're drilling down on this information thing is because information is when humans understand data, understand patterns, and it's the thing used to communicate, and DNA isn't doing that. There's no understanding there. It's just a mechanism. It's just like cogs in a watch, or circuits, or just like the pattern that sand falls over itself. Grains of sand and settle into like a sand dune or something. It's just a result of the mechanisms and physical structures that are there. And for sure, they do stuff that's really interesting to us. But there's not someone who is communicating. Sorry?
No, what drives that then? What drives that? What caused that?
What drives what?
What drives? Just one strand. There's 3 billion base pairs in one strand of DNA, and every sugar molecule in that strand are completely left-hand or right-handed. So that's just an accident.
I mean, at some level, it was happenstance, right? Like the chirality of the molecule at some point in our history was sort of incidental.
It's either, so when we're talking about life, it's either necessary for life to exist, and so then it's going to have some kind of or beneficial, and so it's going to have some kind of selective pressure for it, or it's just a coincidence and that's just how it turned out, or it doesn't do anything, but it doesn't cause any hindrance.
No, that's before life. You're talking about some natural selection. There is no natural selection prior to life.
There's a natural selective.
Hold it. No,
Mike. There are natural selective. There's natural selection mechanisms that act on non-life things, right?
Yeah. Natural selection is just maths. I mean, you can have it just happening in, in numbers, purely described in numbers.
The way it was originally understood by Darwin was in reference to living things, but non-living things can be subject to natural selection and similar mechanisms, right? Like, for instance, the formation of our solar system is a form of natural selection, right?
No, we're not talking about that. We're talking about what we can put in a laboratory. Well, if you want to talk about...
All right, let me answer your question then, Mike. Your question was originally, how did DNA come about, and sort of like, how does that work, right?
But Mike, you couldn't define information for us. So all right. We can't.
The DNA in our cells is not information in the same way that you're thinking about information. The DNA in our cells is chemicals that are naturally selected to be in a particular configuration. They are not interpreted. They are physical structures that are acting according to physical and chemical laws. And the consequences of their particular sequencing are the result of physical processes. There's nothing that's sort of like interpretive, the way that you would read a book. And, like, say in a book, the letters don't have any inherent meaning. You have learned a way to interpret the letters and the words and things like that, and you therefore derive additional understanding or something from it. That is not something that exists in DNA, because DNA was not created by a mind. That is something that people who study DNA and genetics and medicine have put onto it so that we can better understand it and study it, right? It's like we talk about like certain genes and certain gene mutations and stuff, but that's only because it's practical to do so, and because we need to do so in order to understand how things work. But it's not like built into nature. There's like a label. This is the cystic fibrosis gene. This is the gene for like blue eyes. It's just physical processes.
Yeah. I think that lots of people often think of DNA as a bit like a recipe, and it's like a chef reading a recipe and getting getting information from this. It requires 4 eggs, and so then when I whip them together, that's the process I have to do, and then we result in like an omelette or something. And that is the wrong way to think about this. And I think sometimes people will talk about DNA being a code, and I think to a lot of people they might just see a code and a recipe as the same way. But to like an electronic engineer like myself, a computer chip that is just running some software, we're imagining it as like software and like written out a recipe and stuff, but it's actually the same. There's actually just like a big machine here, and the machine happens to be running electrons through it, but it's just like mechanical processes that just happen. You can make a computer just out of a load of cogs, and you can just like crank a handle and it just like, a marble drops through or whatever, and it makes a decision. And it's the same with like DNA stuff. You've just got physical processes that are interacting with each other. And it's just like when we have this chemical and when we have this chemical and they're in the same place, they bind together because that's just the result of these chemicals. And I understand why it can be difficult to perhaps conceptualize that. But I think it's if you come in and just say DNA is information, and then we say, well, what's your definition of information where that makes sense? And then we don't really have one. It just seems like kind of just a claim out of nowhere. How do you respond to that, Mike?
What's that?
How do you respond to what MD and I were just saying?
You back that up to the basic elements. Then there's 118 commonly, straightforward elements, not counting the isotopes, the ME. Okay, 4 elements make up 96% of all living things: hydrogen, carbon, oxygen, nitrogen. Okay,
because they're the most abundant ones.
Hold it here. what other process would it be out of 118 different elements, did it take, what process was there? Trial and error? Or was there a natural selection to get
to what? To select for like these 4 elements?
I mean, they're the ones that stars create, because
they're the most abundant. There's more of them, and so there was more of them around to like be made into stuff to react.
Also, because they're smaller, they're more stable.
But they're arranged into the 20. Stable. Yeah, but there's no brain behind this, according to you. If
correct.
Those 4 particular out of 118, how did it come? Did those come to form the amino acids? Now, I'm not even talking about lipids, the nucleic acids, and the carbohydrates.
I think the MDs
just get to the 20. Just hold it a second. Just to get to the 20 particular and distinct amino acids. What natural selection function there? You'd have to go all the way up past.
Mike, I think we're trying to answer. So what you're.
Hang on. Pause for a second, Mike. Yeah. Is your question about atoms or is it about amino acids? Because you've been switching a bit, or is it about DNA?
1 second. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Oh man, you guys are pathetic.
Mike, come on. You've called in and you've said your original claim was information has to have come somewhere, and I thought this was going to be a really interesting conversation about how we understand information. Instead, you've just claimed that DNA is information, and when we've pointed out that isn't really the case, you haven't been able to provide a definition of information, and now you're trying to talk about amino acids and elements. And MD's asked a really quite sensible question here to say, well, what is the actual question? Like, what are you asking? Are you asking why these elements show up most commonly in living things? And the answer is what he's already said, which is, they're the most abundant and they're the most stable, and so they're the ones we have around. Or is the question how did amino acids first start forming? Which is a different question to why they're made up from these elements. And I don't really see why all these elements are the most common is even interesting. Because, so what? If you're saying that some intelligent thing created the universe, and it's I'm going to have 118 elements for some reason, even though most of them I don't really have a use for, and then I'm going to make life out of 4 of them for some reason. Well, mostly life out of 4. Why even have elements? What's the point? This is this completely nonsense thing. And why even have all this information communicate that you're claiming that there is? It just.
I think that this is sort of what I was talking about earlier. Is there's a connection, I think, Mike, that you're making. You're saying there's 4 most abundant elements in our body. There's 20 amino acids that are used in our body. There's ATCG, whatever, these properties of DNA, and therefore God. And what I think we're missing is all the stuff in between that gets us from why is it relevant that there's only 4 elements to get to God? That's the sort of stuff that we're missing. We need to fill in that gap.
So, Mike, I would, if you want to address that position, I'm just about to unmute you. So that would be cool. But I don't think you need to be calling people pathetic. You're the one who's called in, who seems to be dodging questions and not providing definitions. So here is your chance. Here is your chance to resurrect this conversation. Mike?
Yeah. Okay. What method to get I backed up to the 118 elements is how they specifically came together to form the 20 specific chiral amino acids. You're saying there's some kind of a mechanism there that's natural selection? How it's just odds. There's no feedback like a living thing. And
so I think, all right, maybe this will help. There's selection that occurs on a chemical level when it comes to replication, right? So again, it's been a minute since I was reading up on abiogenesis, but most scientists who study origins think that chemicals developed the properties of being self-replicating at some point, and that was sort of where this stuff came from. And self-replicating arrangements of molecules or arrangements of atoms would obviously become more abundant than non-self-replicating arrangements of atoms, because they're self-replicating, right? Like, it's an inherent property. So if a chemical or anything really has the property of being self-replicating and nothing else in the environment does, eventually that thing is going to become more abundant in that environment. Does that make sense,
that's natural
Mike?
selection.
Yeah, exactly. That's a form of natural selection.
It's just maths.
Yeah, but how do you get to the self-replicating cell, like RNA or DNA?
So
how do you get to there first?
We're trying to, the point is, with all of this stuff, is there are loads of very slow steps. Obviously, we don't go from the local star creates hydrogen and then pow, we've got like humans. There is billions of years here involved. So I'm just saying that when we, MD's just pointed out that one of the first steps here that we can highlight as being interesting is when we get chemicals which can self-replicate, which is that's quite a cool thing. It's, it's an interesting thing to look out for and see happening. And that doesn't mean we're saying the next step is cells, or the next step is cells recreating themselves. It's that when we've got some chemicals that can self-replicate and some others that don't, then we're going to have more of that chemical. And then when there are more than one different type of chemical that can self-replicate, then they may well be competing for various components in that. Or they might be competing for space, or they might, combine in different ways when they meet each other. And then there ends up being a really interesting and complicated process of loads of different chemicals doing loads of different stuff all at the same time. We're not just suddenly saying... Sorry, go ahead.
Name one chemical that self-replicates.
DNA.
But it's not water. But it's not a chemical itself.
Sure, it is. DNA is a chemical.
Deoxyribonucleic acid.
Yeah, deoxyribonucleic acid. That's a chemical. Well, what do you think a chemical is, Mike? What's your definition of a chemical?
Self.
What?
Well, it's the elements. It's a combination of molecules.
Everything's a combination of elements.
Chemical can be a distinctive pile of atoms, just like copper or like carbon, hydrogen.
So sorry, Mike. Can you
water is a chemical,
right? I agree. So you're saying a chemical has to be a simple molecule?
Yeah, that arrange itself into that particular pattern that is like DNA. It's not just a specific range, specifically ranged. So what you're saying is, if you manage to make a DNA molecule, it's going to automatically self-replicate
under the correct environmental conditions.
Yeah, which is the same for anything. It needs the right conditions.
But what is it going to self-replicate from? What's its source?
That's what we need by the right conditions. It needs some of the components required for DNA.
Well, it's the same as saying humans are self-replicating, right? Humans are self-replicating. Well, I mean, you need two. So maybe, all right, let's pick an asexual reproducing thing like a bacteria. A bacterium is self-replicating, but you can't put a bacterium in a vacuum and expect it to self-replicate, right? Yeah. You need to give it the raw materials.
Yeah.
Yeah, so it's the same with chemical, like any self-replicating chemical.
But a bacterium, a live self-replicating bacterium, is not just a couple chemicals. It's a whole bunch of range of things.
Yeah, but what's the difference? So you can put. So okay, do you know how we do testing for COVID, the PCR test? That is a method of rapidly replicating DNA. Right? That's how we test for COVID. We do it in a test tube where this is, I was talking about earlier how I worked in a plant genetics lab. That was my thesis, was working on getting this DNA to self-replicate, and you have to get it in the right conditions, the right temperature for the right period of time. You have to give it all the building blocks, and then it'll self-replicate. But it's just chemical processes. There's no like magic. You just have to give it the right environmental conditions.
You're ignoring the human influence and the laboratory itself.
Yeah, sure, but like again, we can grow bacteria. So a laboratory is just a way of controlling the environmental conditions. And usually what we're trying to do is replicate on a smaller scale what occurs in nature.
You're using terms trying, just like the Miller-Urey experiment, to form amino acids to prove that the amino acids form naturally. How is an enclosed glass apparatus with a trap, how is that anything like a natural condition?
Well, the idea is that you create a lab which replicates some natural conditions. You want to, if we want to be able to see if we can create the starting conditions for these kind of things, we say, well, what conditions can we do it in? We can make a lab and we can create these conditions, and we've created this thing. And now we can say, could this condition have ever arisen on Earth at any point? And if the answer is no, then we know that that isn't the way that it worked. But we might be able to say, well, now we've got it working under these conditions, we can try and find some similar conditions, which are conditions that we've had on Earth. And that's the point of doing these experiments. And then when we have a situation where we're like, wow, we've created the conditions, that once was on Earth, and we've got these chemicals which are self-replicating, then we've shown that it's possible. That's the argument here.
You can't make in a laboratory a full set of the 20 particular distinct amino acids.
We can't yet.
And that they won't form into a protein. And you can't go the other way by stripping amino acids out of animal and.
Okay, Mike, I have a question. Before you go on, I just want to ask: do you mean that we can't, or that we haven't yet?
You can't.
How do you know that?
Yeah,
are you saying it's impossible? It's because theoretically impossible?
Well, just like I know that scientists build an airplane, right? Science builds airplanes.
Yeah, and one time someone said it's impossible to fly, and now we can. So I think it's ridiculous to say that it can never happen. I feel like we're a little bit going around in circles here, Mike. It's an interesting discussion, but I think that maybe we could move on, because we do have quite a lot of other callers, and perhaps maybe you could do some research on self-replicating chemicals. I did actually just have a look, and there was some researchers in the Netherlands who found a chemical which can reproduce, and it's benzenes. And it's like a ring of hydrocarbons with sulfur involved, and it self-replicates, and that's just a chemical. It's not an amino acid, although that an amino acid is a chemical. It's not DNA, which is also a chemical, but it's maybe something you will respect as a chemical under your definition. It's just a bunch of, I don't know, you won't be able to see on here in it. It's just like a bunch of hydrogen and carbon and stuff, and that can self-replicate. So perhaps go and look up, what chemicals can self-replicate, and call in another time. Perhaps you can continue the discussion then. But we do have some more callers, and we'd like to get to those.